A mother once told the story of tucking her only child into bed before he shipped off to military training. She placed a small folded American flag on his pillow, the same one her father received when he came home from World War II. She said, "This is just to remind you how much one life can matter." After he left, she would walk past his room and see the empty bed. Every time her heart would tighten with worry and pride because when you only have one child, that child is the center of your world. As she told that story, she suddenly paused and said these heart piercing words: "I can't imagine what it must have been like for God to send his only son." As the father of an only child, my ears perk up to the many only child stories in Scripture, but none compares to God's one of a kind Son. Greetings, Patriots. I'm Perry Green, and this is God in America, where we remember that faith shaped our freedom, and freedom flourishes only when rooted in faith. In the Christmas season, we reflect on the biblical theme of the only child and how every story in Scripture points us to God's eternal story, his gift of his only begotten Son. With Easter's recent passing, we must not forget the story of God's unique Son. The Bible contains several moving stories of only children. Their lives were precious, protected, and often destined for something special. Here are four. Isaac was Abraham's only son of promise. Abraham waited decades for the child God guaranteed. When Isaac finally came, God eventually called Abraham to sacrifice him. That is your son, your only son, whom you love. Isaac was the miracle child, the covenant child, the child of promise. God stopped the sacrifice and substituted a ram in his place. A widow in Zarephath lost her only child to illness. Her future, her security, her legacy were all gone. But God restored him through Elijah. Then there's the widow of Nain's only son, raised to new life by Jesus in Luke 7. Jesus met a funeral procession and saw a grieving mother. He was, Luke said, her only son, and she was a widow. Jesus' heart moved with compassion. He touched the bier and restored the boy to life. And then Jairus' daughter was his only child, according to Luke 8. He was a synagogue leader, desperate and afraid, pleading for his dying daughter. Luke emphasized she was his only daughter, about 12 years of age, and then another miracle followed. These stories touch our emotions because an only child carries a unique weight in the heart. But each of them, Isaac, the widow's son, Jairus' daughter, was restored, saved, and protected. Yet the most stunning contrast in Scripture is this: God did not spare his only son. John 3:16 tells us, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son," or his only begotten son. Romans 8, verse 32 says, "He who did not spare his own son, but freely gave him up for us all." Let that sink in. Where earthly parents cry out to save their only child, God forfeited his only son so he could save the world. Isaac was spared. The widow's son was spared. Jairus' daughter was spared. But Jesus, God's only begotten son, was sacrificed. This is the heart of the gospel. Not merely that Jesus came, but that the Father sent him. Not merely that Jesus died, but that the Father gave him. This is the greatest gift ever offered to humankind. Early Americans understood this truth deeply. For them, Christianity wasn't a cultural accessory, it was the bedrock of life. The Pilgrims carried the gospel across an ocean. They believed Christ's sacrifice made them free from sin, and Christ's lordship made them free from tyranny. Colonial families centered education on Scripture. Their children learned to read so they could read the Bible and know the story of God's only Son. Revivals during the Great Awakening focused on Christ crucified. Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, and others preached the miracle of salvation through Christ alone. Thousands came to faith, and entire communities were transformed. The founders assumed a people shaped by the gospel. John Adams wrote, "The general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. The principles were shaped by Scripture, especially the gospel story." Early America thrived not because of the brilliance or strength of its people, but because its people believed in the God who freely gave his one and only Son. Today, we've grown too familiar with the Jesus story. As a result, we live in a culture that undervalues Christ, dismisses Scripture, replaces worship with entertainment, and celebrates independence from God rather than dependence on him. But when we see the gospel afresh, it calls us back to the heart of the Father who gave his only Son so that we might live. It calls us to appreciate the salvation purchased at such a high price. May we return to the reverence our forefathers had. Let gratitude shape how we live, speak, and serve. Teach the next generation the story of Christ's love. A nation that forgets Christ forgets the very foundation of its blessing. Just as the mother placed that flag on her son's pillow to remind him of sacrifice, we must set the cross before our eyes every day to remember the sacrifice of the only Son of God. If we forget, we may go through the motions of Christian faith insincerely. Let's cherish the gift of God's only Son, to live in gratitude for his sacrifice and to pass his faith on to the generations who follow. Well, thank you for joining me today. Please like, share, follow, and subscribe to our podcast. Until next time, let's keep the light of God's one and only Son burning.